The development of the eBook, until quite recently, has followed the tradition set out by Michael Hart with the Gutenberg project, which is essentially to enhance but not to challenge the traditional notion of reading and publication. And the Kindle, which was brought out in 2007, was very much the latest variation in that trend. What I want to look at now, though, is how many of the secrets to what eBooks could become actually lie in the past. And the answer that we may be looking for perhaps was already apparent hundreds of years ago in the medieval reading traditions. But before we look at those developments, I want to go back to the medieval world, and I want to consider some historical contexts that shed some interesting light on how the digital affordances of technology today might be harnessed in ways which are radically different to what we see in the current ebook. Now, the reading cultures and practices of the medieval period, what we refer to as the codex, bear more in common with the digital practices and affordances of hypertext than they do with the print-based book. Hypertext describes the ability to move between non-sequential information in a digital environment, and in many ways this is the cornerstone of the internet. It's what makes the internet work. But in many respects, it was also evident in these medieval codex or medieval manuscripts. And the first way in which is evident is clear in this illustration. It's clear in the red text, which is referred to as rubric, the rubric. And these were essentially navigation aids that allowed the reader to move between different levels and different types of information, just like hypertext does today. And they were used to highlight section headings, to space names out, and later became the format for chapters. Now, although you could not physically click on these, obviously, to the medieval reader, these would have been a very powerful signal and signpost as to how to navigate around the book. Another way in which medieval readers would make their way through a book was through what were called glosses. Now, a gloss was a written note in the margin or between the lines. It was very common in things like the Bible because the intention was for the writer, in this case the scribe, to give you, if you like, the right conclusion. So it helped the reader to understand what all this dense text was about. But it was also widely used to cross-reference materials between and across the entire codex. So essentially, it was what we would refer to today as a glossary. These glosses were ways in which you could understand different elements of the text. The final and perhaps the most well-known format or medieval format that allowed people to navigate and understand are the illuminations. Now, many people think that illuminated manuscripts like this are just pictures. But to the medieval world and mindset, this picture would have been interpreted as an additional navigation aid to help them to understand what the text was saying. In other words, to read between the lines, what's often referred to as intertextual information. They were in effect icons. And this is a good example because in some senses, to the modern reader, this seems to be two scribes writing in their books, or copying their books. But to the medieval mind, it would have been really clear that the scribe on the left has actually died and has been superseded by the scribe on the right. So that this is a pointer, this is a marker that indicates that the author has changed. And whilst that is completely illegible to the modern mind, it would have been very clear to the trained medieval mind. And in that sense, these three elements served as ways in which the medieval reader could move around the book in a non-sequential reading fashion. In terms of the medieval world, it has to be said that they had again a totally different mindset as to what a book was all about. For them, the medieval codex was a very interactive experience. And perhaps one of the best examples to demonstrate this is what we call marginalia, which are these texts, both under the lines and at the right-hand side, which have been added after the scribe made the original copy. So people have written their own notes, which are more than an aide-memoire in the right-hand margin. I say more than an aide-memoire, they're not simply for them to remember something. The idea was seen very much as part of the civic duty to annotate a text. So if you read it, it was seen as your duty to leave your thoughts and ideas about it in the margin for the next reader to take on. And this would have been fully understood by the comments that were read and by the communities who picked this up. And therefore, in a sense, these books were not written by one author, but rather they were developed by a community. So the notion of a single authorial voice, which is very much our modern way of thinking about books and about authorship, would have been quite alien to the medieval world. And it's interesting, of course, that today we frown upon the idea of writing in the margin, and yet this was very much a medieval tradition. And there has been some research undertaken in the USA into the habits of students who buy second-hand books. And it's fascinating because this research seems to point out that the books students purchase are not necessarily those in the best condition, but they're those with the best margin notes by the previous reader. If we think about the equivalent today, the equivalent of this kind of marginalia would be to leave a comment on a blog post, or maybe to respond to a Twitter post. And in that sense, a blog is very similar to a medieval codex, because it's not written by one person, but rather it's developed by a number of people who participate dynamically in the process of writing and responding to comments.